Hi guys, and welcome to this revision tutorial on the power and conflict poems for AQA. In this session I want to go really quickly through every poem with just some of the more obvious and basic points and thinking about how you would link them in the exam. Okay, so I'm going to start by looking at Ozymandias by Shelley. Forgive me for my little typo there when I was retyping the names up. So we know that this is based on Ramesses, a ruler in ancient Egypt who created a number, or had his slaves create a number of statues in his honour, and that he believed himself to be so powerful and mighty and godlike that his legacy would last for thousands of years. And what Shelley really kind of conveys to us is that now, thousands of years on, this statue is trunkless, its face is shattered and half sunk, and that now really it is a colossal wreck, boundless and bare. And so despite how power-mad Ramesses was, the power of nature is stronger. So which poems does this link to? Well, it links to the Prelude and Storm on the Island. And in terms of powerful people or abusing power, it also links quite nicely to My Last Duchess. So focus on this poem if you get something around abuse of power or the power of nature being stronger than people. Focusing then now onto My Last Duchess, written by Robert Browning. We know then that the narrator of this poem is that this is written as a drug, and that we've got the voice of a duke who is relaying to a visitor to his home the story of his last duchess. Now I would focus on this poem on the fact it's his last duchess, the idea that this immediately draws us into the sense that she is dead, or that she is a previous wife, and that immediately creates a somewhat of a sinister tone because she's not, she's no longer there. Why isn't she there? And it creates immediate intrigue for us as readers. Other things that I would think are rather important is that he states that none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I. And this shows something of his possessive nature. He tells his visitor that nobody is allowed to look at this picture unless he pulls the curtain apart and lets them see it. He goes on to relay some of the problems of his wife, some of the things that she did wrong, allegedly. And a good quote to remember is that he calls the kind of flush she would get on her cheek a spot of joy. And here, a spot having connotations of flaw, a stain, he doesn't like that. Other things it'd be worth mentioning if you get this poem is the Caesura. There's a lot of pauses as he makes his way through this explanation, as though he's struggling to think about what he wants to convey. So this is very slow and deliberate. Everything is very well considered. He goes on to talk about the things that she did wrong, and really we learn that ultimately her crime was that she was not grateful enough to him for marrying her. And he talks about here, she thanked men good, but thanked as if she ranked my gift of a 900-years-old name with anybody's gift. So really here, there's a sense of pride. So if pride was a key word in a question, we can see that quite easily so. He conveys to his listener that he refuses to tell her off, tell her what disgusts him, and he feels that nothing he could have said would have made a difference anyway. One of the most sinister lines is, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. We really see here his abuse of power, and what he is intimating or implying is that he had his wife killed. We see then towards the end of the poem that he goes down the stairs, or he goes to meet now the Count, who is this visitor's master, to discuss the upcoming marriage of the Duke to this man's daughter. And let's look at how he views this upcoming marriage. Well, he uses the noun object. Clearly this is a character who objectifies women and views them as possessions. And he draws attention to this little statue, he says, Neptune, though taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. So this last image really is a metaphor. We've got Neptune, the god, taming a seahorse, something which was rare and beautiful and fragile, in much the same way that the Count has, the Duke, has tamed his last Duchess. So good poems to link this to, because they're about abusing power. As I said previously, this would work very well with Ozymandias. It might work quite nicely with London, because you're thinking about the aristocracy and those with power against powerless people. It may come back to me others. Right, let's have a look. Charge of the Light Brigade. We know from our studies that Charge of the Light Brigade is based on real-life conflict. So it's Crimean War. And we know that this was a failed charge led by Lord Cardigan, where some of the best, bravest and best of our soldiers, British soldiers, were sent into an almost disastrous battle situation. First things you might want to talk about are structural. This used the repetition of half a league, and it creates that pace, which reminds us of the galloping of horses. We get the reference to he said. Now, whether this is Lord Cardigan, who denied kind of responsibility or not, is ambiguous. But certainly we get the sense that this is somebody's fault, this decision. We have the reference to the Valley of Death. And this is a repeated image, Valley of Death. Equally, Jaws of Death, Mouth of Hell. We get these repeated images, metaphors really, about the disastrous and deadly nature of the place that the men were going into. Other structural things that are important are repetition of Road the 600, which we see goes all the way down to the fourth stanza when it is not the 600. And really that repetition helps to reinforce the losses, that they rode in together as a team, as a unit, and that was destroyed. Other things that we might want to make reference to, the idea of the men being surrounded. Now we get this anaphora, repetition of the start part of a line, but you could just say repetition. But either way, we see how overwhelming and surrounded the men were. I'd also expect us to think about some of the violent verbs, particularly in stanza 3, which show the danger. And some of those images are obviously, as we know, repeated later on in the poem. We know that even as they retreated, they were still surrounded. We've got elements like stormed at with shot and shell. So we've got some sibilants here to convey the sort of sound effects of the battle, the sounds of battle. And other important things we might say as that Tennyson uses this imperative at the end, telling us and instructing us to honour and respect the Light Brigade and everything that they've done. So this links nicely, very nicely, with Bayonet Charge. You could also say that it fits with Remains and Exposure, all of these looking at the experience of war. Possibly you could look at how it links to Poppies, people back home who were having the sort of consequences of these conflicts. So Charge of the Light Brigade is a great one to bring in. There's loads of techniques. It fits nicely with pretty much any poem. Right, London. So Blake's London, he's a Victorian writer. So he's writing, some of your context if you've done Christmas Carol fits in quite nicely here. But this is an idea about place and power versus powerlessness. Excuse my annotations there. And so we get here, the chartered streets and the chartered Thames. We get the idea of the wealthy few who own and have kind of divided up London. We get some of those images, but actually what we see are weakness and woe. So what Blake sees actually around him in London is misery And we get here many of the problems, you know, around the pollution and the filth and the squalor. We get mention here of the blackening church appalls. So we've got the black sort of filth and pollution that's staining the churches, but also there's a criticism here of church in that it could have maybe done more to help. We get ideas around prostitution, and orphans being born and abandoned, and the idea that they are these children who are the offspring of people visiting prostitutes are now kind of plaguing not only marriages, the hearse here being a funeral car, but also society as a whole. All these things to do with poverty and deprivation, they're storing up problems for us as a society. Because this is to do with place, you could link it to the Prelude, you could also link it to Ozymandias. What else? Just remind myself of all the different poems. You could... I'll come back to that. Right, Camicazi. So we've got the context here of, you know, World War and kamikaze pilots who are expected to show enough courage that they would kill themselves rather than be captured. And this focuses on much of the kind of shame of the father, the idea that he has been disgraced because he did not die within the conflict. And you've got lots of kind of images here of nature and unnatural. You get images of the plains against the beauty of the kind of the ocean, and we see here about the father coming home, and one of the key things is, you know, they treated him as though he'd no longer existed. Sometimes she said he must have wondered which has been the better way to die. So if you did get this, really it focuses very much around remains and exposure in terms of, you know, some of the ideas around the futility of war, the pointlessness of it, and the way in which soldiers are treated. So this is very much to do with conflict. I should perhaps have done that with this. London is really focusing and centering more on power. Tragedy Light Brigade could be both. Lots of has probably more power. Ozymandias more power. Right, Storm on the Island. So we know that this is definitely focusing on power, and it's the power of nature against people. So Ozymandias is a good one to run with it. I expect that neither Storm on the Island or Ozymandias will be on your exam in 2017 because they were both practice questions, but you never know. And really what we'd be focusing on is that conflict or that juxtaposition between nature and people. And you've got things like a tame cat turned savage. You've got elements that sound very warlike, exploding, comfortably bombarded. So you've got kind of war imagery, which some people do say evokes ideas of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, but also just really conveys how powerful nature is and these ideas of savagery. The people are prepared, but that being said, all they can do is shelter and hide. So power of nature fits with Ozymandias, definitely fits with exposure quite nicely. Okay, the Prelude. Really focuses on the story of or a memory that Wordsworth has as he reminisces about childhood. And he steals a boat, rows it out into one of the lakes in the Lake District, and then ultimately spooks himself, gets frightened. And he is frightened ultimately by the power of nature. And this bothers him, and he reflects on it for many days and for much time afterwards. So he talks about, think about his depiction of nature: craggy, a huge peak, black and huge, that repetition of its size. So we've got the adjectives used to describe it, and the repetition of size, which shows how sort of small and insignificant he is compared to it. and it seems, he feels as though it was like a living thing strode after me. So his personification of the mountains shows that he feels very small and insignificant. So this could fit quite nicely with Storm on the Island. It could also fit with Ozymandias. Okay. Remains. Okay, one of my favourite poems. Armitage based this on real soldiers' experience, this documentary. If you've got time just before your exam, maybe have a look at this, because this really focuses on PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that some soldiers returning from war suffer from, and some of the issues that go with this. So this is about conflict, but it's not just about a war in the Middle East, it's also about very much inner conflict, the dealing with the aftermath of this. And we get that here from reference towards the end about the drink and drugs won't flush him out. So we look at people coping or not coping, and we get this idea of it still feels very real. He's still in the moment, and he's still very much traumatized. Some of the things in this are to note are the kind of colloquial sort of speaking style. Let's have a look. One of my mates goes by, tosses his guts back in. The whole killing of this looter, which is questionable anyway, Armitage uses these tentative words, probably and possibly, to show, was there really a cause to kill him? We get the graphic imagery, don't we, of what it looked like, and we know that on patrol, this soldier is having to see this day in, day out. This works well with any of the war-based poems, but maybe particularly well with Bayonet Charge. Also maybe with Camicazi, because it's about dealing with the after effects. Okay, right, oh blimey, 17 minutes in. Okay, Emigree, we'll go quite quickly through this. I don't believe that this is a poem that they're going to put in the exam because it's really super complex. But really, what this focuses on someone who left their home as a child and returns to it. There's real ambiguity about where this place is. And it's deliberately vague. This could be any war-torn place that is under the rule of a dictatorship and focuses on people being trapped. I would focus on the conflict between me and they, this sort of divisiveness, division between people. And if you were going to be comparing this, checking out my history, maybe Camicazi, maybe Tissues. Okay, right, I'm trying to whiz through these. I'm sorry if some of them are a bit quick. I'd have liked to have had time to do one on each poem in much more depth, but just as a last-minute revision. Checking Out My History by John Agard, then, is very much, it's quite confrontational in its approach, as is often the style with Agard. He's really challenging people and challenging them to reconsider various different stereotypes. So he refers to a number of different people who, on different historical events, who have influenced him and influenced his culture. And really the focus on this is all about the way in which there's a kind of deliberate neglect of elements of kind of black culture and other full range of cultures, and that really sort of the history books focus very much on elements of British and white history at the expense of other cultures. And obviously what we see, which is classic Agard, dem tell me, we get this very colloquial style. He writes often quite phonetically, and we again get this conflict between them and me. Again, this idea of divisiveness, which is why this would fit really quite well with the emigre. Okay, looking at Puppies, a really poignant poem, you know, emotive little poem here, which focuses on a mother's loss of a son, and really the ways in which she copes or doesn't cope particularly well with the loss of him. So we have these memories here about the ways in which she dealt with him going to war. We know that she wanted to cry, you know, her face was softening and she steeled it. So we get this metaphor here of her being strong for her son leaving, and she talks about being brave, even though she found this really difficult. We can see the love that she had because she was fussing over him, taking hairs off his clothes and making sure his hair looked right. And she goes away, and there's some ambiguity here, but she releases the songbird from its cage. Possibly she's crying here or howling, or some people say that this is her just being at peace with what's happening. I think that's up to your interpretations. But now the position she's left in is that she is outside in November, hatless, without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf and gloves. So she's cold and exposed. And she's not taking care of herself, maybe neglecting herself because of her grief. She goes to see the war memorial, which she leans against. She obviously feels like this will help her be close to him. And she has that longing, doesn't she, to hear his voice again. So in terms of conflict, this really links really quite well with, let's have a look, with exposure in some ways, oddly, because it's, the mother is exposed here as well, but it fits with bayonet charge, both, inexperienced soldiers struggle in war zones, war photographer maybe. So looking then at Tissue by Imtiaz Darka, really this focuses on, I think this is one of the hardest poems, but Tissue is a metaphor for life. It goes through a number of different ideas of how paper can be used for maps, for religious purposes, for receipts. So paper and tissue has all these different uses, but can be quite fragile. So really it's the idea that that life and human life, in all its diversity and all its differences, can be equally fragile. It can be beautiful, it can be strong, it can be old, and it's quite a complex poem that I think I'm not doing it justice to mention it here, and I think it'd be as well to have a look at an individual sort of tutorial to make sure you're clear on that. But if you did get it and it did crop up, I think it would work probably well with the emigre and maybe Ozymandias because of that kind of fragility of life. Bayonet Charge, great poem. I hope that this comes up onto your exam, and if it does, make sure you focus on things like the beginning of this poem, starting with that adverb suddenly, which tells us about that kind of immediate and urgent tone that the poem begins with, reflecting that soldiers obviously had to be up and running quickly. And we know that this individual soldier, we know from these verbs that this soldier is struggling and is exhausted. We know that it's a dangerous environment, the belly out of the air, that personification, but we get the sense and the sound effect of the bullets flying. We know that this soldier, ultimately, he gets into a sort of sense of shell shock. We get this image where his foot hung like statue in midair. So that simile there compares him to a statue. He is literally frozen in the battlefield until he sees a hair that is rolling around like a flame. This has been injured and is dying, and it kind of prompts him and motivates him to run on, and we see that he plunges past. Interestingly, Hughes uses this listing to convey all of his former reasons for joining up and enlisting are now like luxuries because of the terrifying situation he's in. So this fits with Remains, it fits really well with Charge of the Light Brigade, it fits with Exposure quite nicely as well. Okay, last two, bear with me. War Photographer. So if you get that, this is all about conflicted identity, you know, someone who feels a real sense of guilt because of what they do, the job that they do. They see horrors, and, you know, we get a number of different places that they've been, the horrors that they've seen, and then they go back, rural England, home again. So it's this juxtaposition between war and kind of the comfort and safety of England, and this idea of it all being for a commercial consumer experience, you know, 100 agonies that they'll pick 4 or 5 for the supplement. And there's a real sort of criticism of people who are kind of neglecting some of the problems. You know, they might feel a bit sad while they look at it whilst they have a beer, and then they move on. So this is about inner conflict, and so then ones like Camicazi work with this, and definitely Remains works quite nicely with it as well. Let's have a look. Maybe Prelude could work there as well. So last one, Exposure. Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen, we know, was in World War I and died during that conflict. So this is a real sort of first-hand experience. Now, these soldiers are not front line. They are sort of waiting for things to happen, in a sense. We get, one of the key things is repetition of nothing happens. And this showing, in some ways, something to do with the kind of horror of anticipation, that actually it might be better to be there on the front line, because here they are there waiting. And the things that could happen to them, well, we get the merciless winds that knife us. So think about that, you know, they're really brought to life, aren't they? And they're personified as being quite brutal and it being painful. And we get senses of paranoia and doubt through the use of these rhetorical questions. There's a couple there. And so Hughes conveys that the soldiers are experiencing real doubt. They are reminded about kind of the barbed wire is moving in the wind, and it reminds them of the horrors they've seen of men tangled up in it, and it's sort of spooking them, and, you know, we get just images of trauma here. And as the poem goes on, we see that they cringe in holes. It's quite an animalistic image, and they seem really quite weak and vulnerable in the face of this extreme weather. They are sun-dozed, and their memories return, don't they, of home return to them. But actually, this frost will fasten on the mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads, the burying party. So all their eyes are ice. We get this horrific image towards the end of men who are frozen to death. And this feels really, you know, some of the feel here is that this is needless. They didn't need to die. They're not going over the top and fighting. This is, you know, the people in charge who have not cared for or looked after the soldiers and prepared them as they should have been. So bayonet charge, Puppies, Charge of the Light Brigade, and because of some of those feelings of paranoia and doubt, definitely Remains fits with that as well. I mean, any of the poems will fit together. I've just put a few of them together on here. But really, you know, it's up to you. Choose poems that you know well to compare to each other. And just best of luck with this exam.